Thank you. Hoban, let me say, I'm from Texas. This is bloody cold right now. And it may be a sign that hell is frozen over. Because what we've seen in Washington is we've seen Republicans come together united. I'm here today to praise the Republican majority in the House of Representatives. They came together, they stood as one, and they passed a serious bill that avoids a default on our debt and that makes serious steps to reining in the out-of-control spending and the debt that is bankrupting our kids and grandkids. If you're at home and you're sick and tired of the inflation that is making life harder each and every day, you're tired of paying more at the grocery store, you're tired of paying more in rent, you're tired of paying more at the gas pump, it was caused by trillions of dollars of spending from out-of-control Democrats. And the House majority has stood up and led and said we've got to rein that back in for the working families who are hurting across this country. Senate Republicans are here today standing shoulder to shoulder, united with House Republicans. And I have to say the behavior of President Biden to date on this issue has been wildly reckless and irresponsible. Biden's position has been, up until 2 days ago, he would not negotiate, he would not compromise, he wouldn't even sit down and talk. That was obviously unreasonable. And Biden was doing more than that. He was threatening default of the debt. He was playing roulette with the American economy. Let me be clear. There is one man on planet Earth, and one man only, who can ensure we do not default on our debt. His name is Joseph Robinette Biden, Jr. And here's what a responsible president would say. He would stand up and say, America will never, ever, ever default on our debt. Every month, federal tax revenues exceed cost for the interest of the debt. If the president said we won't default on our debt, we wouldn't. But there's a reason Biden is not saying that. He wants to scaremonger. He wants to scare the stock market. He wants to scare the bond markets. He's counting on the corporate media to echo his scaremongering. But I've got very simple advice on who President Joe Biden should listen to. President Joe Biden should listen to Vice President Joe Biden. In 2011, when Republicans in the House stood strong on the debt ceiling, again because Democrats had had majority of the Congress for 2 years, had passed trillions in irresponsible spending, and Republicans stood strong and said we will not raise the debt ceiling without serious fiscal reform. What happened? Then Vice President Joe Biden came and negotiated a deal called the Budget Control Act, that was designed to cut $2.3 trillion in spending. It was the most significant federal spending reform in modern times. That happened because Barack Obama blinked, and Biden, Vice President Biden, sat down with House Republicans and reached a meaningful compromise. President Joe Biden needs to do the same thing, and I'll say, sadly, the reason he hasn't so far, I believe, is because his mental faculties are too diminished right now to do what he did in 2011, to sit down and actually work together on a solution to the problems. And what we're left with is a bunch of young staffers in the White House, radical children, who are perfectly willing to risk a default on the debt because they have no appreciation of the chaos and misery and damage a default would do. We should not default on our debt, but the present path we're on is unsustainable, and Joe Biden needs to come to the table. And I will say it is a major victory for America that the day before yesterday, Biden finally blinked and said, okay, I'll sit down and talk. That's the first step. Now, the second step is let's solve the problem. With that, let's open it up to questions.
If McCarthy and Biden sit down are having what McCarthy and maybe you all deem to be productive conversations, is there an openness to doing anything short-term on the debt limit to let those conversations, like you've done on spending before, come to a conclusion?
We don't have to.
We can reach a resolution here I believe the resolution is going to be a compromise. But for there to be a compromise, the radical Democrats have to be willing to compromise. To date, they have not been willing to do so. They created this problem, and they have not demonstrated any willingness to be part of solving it. Look, I can tell you a short-term extension, a clean debt ceiling, is not going to pass Congress. That is a solution that the White House has fevered dreams of, but it's not going to pass Congress, nor should it, because doing that would be disregarding our constituents at home who are hurting, who are facing the consequences of this uncontrolled spending.
Can I just add? Let me reiterate how incredibly reasonable the House proposal is. Now, from my standpoint, what should happen here is Chuck Schumer ought to bring their bill up to the floor, pass it, and President Biden ought to sign it. That's what that conversation ought to be about next week in terms of when he will do that. Again, $4.4 trillion to $6.3 on a path to $6.9 trillion. Paring it back to 6.3 is eminently reasonable, and that is really what we want to support right now is the House bill. Let's get that passed. We can do this immediately. We don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for an extended negotiation.
They ought to be. Biden should be sitting down and negotiating every day, getting this done. This is the most important thing he should be doing right now, and by being missing in action is wrong.
Well, as we look ahead to next week when he is having the meeting with the other three lawmakers here on the Hill, are you comfortable and do you think that Speaker McCarthy is the best messenger for Republicans in that meeting, or should McConnell be taking a bigger posture in this meeting, a more aggressive posture?
Well, the House passed the bill. He should negotiate the bill. The bill's got to get through the House. But I think all of us are here because we want to do everything we can to make sure Senate Republicans we're all united, and we'll also help the House. I don't know if anybody else. Look at what he did. I mean, he got 217 House Republicans to agree to something. Yeah, I don't know how many had never voted for a debt ceiling increase before. I mean, a bunch. So it's remarkable what Kevin did. Yes.
Senator, thank you. Jackson Richmond with the Epic Times. I'm going to ask a couple questions and then popcorn it over to my colleague Melina from NTD, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you. What level of spending cuts are you willing to accept in order to raise the debt limit? Let's say you pass a compromise. What's to stop future, what would stop members of Congress from waiving that requirement? Like, that could be done under the BCA.
Well, first off, I think we ought to be passing the House bill. Okay, that's the only thing we ought to be talking about now. And I think I think it is important to always make sure it's not something that's easily waived in the future. And I think that's one thing they tried to do is make sure that's not what happens.
And again, I want to push back on this phrase spending cuts. Again, 2019, $4.4 trillion. And we spent way in excess of $6 trillion during the pandemic. 2022, $6.3 trillion. Biden wants to spend $6.9 trillion. I mean, understand how insane that is in terms of growth in spending. So all we're trying to do is limit the growth of spending, put us back on some reasonable glide path. Had we gone back to just a baseline in 2019, grew it by inflation, population growth, which would be a reasonable way to budget, right? Mm-hmm. Last year we spent $5.1 trillion. We spent 6.3. So let's not talk about budget cuts. Let's not let the Democrats get away with that. We're trying to rein this in and put us on a more reasonable and sustainable spending glide path.
And then just to follow up, so how would you all respond if President Biden did something like invoking the 14th Amendment and directed the Treasury to continuing borrowing money to meet the country's financial obligations?
He can't do that. And and by the way, I mean, I just don't get it. Why didn't he just do his job? I mean, we all know how the Constitution works. There's, the White House has to negotiate with the House and the Senate. We don't get to pass just what we want. I mean, do his job, show up.